So I started my career in the Army. I was in uniform, deployed overseas a whole bunch, did lots in that preventative mental health space. And I know you wouldn't guess it by what you read about in the media about soldier mental health, but there is a lot of work that's put into preparing soldiers for high stress environments, managing their mental health while they're experiencing it, and then supporting their reintegration once they come home. I've been in the employee assistance program industry space since then, in workplace psychology, and doing a lot of work around preventative training. And I thought what I'd go through today was a little bit of an overview of mental health at work. And I've got a particular passion for the security industry as the co-owner of a boutique security company, and recognising some of the challenges that security guards face and some of the gaps in professional development for guards, which if we can close some of those gaps, I think we're going to improve the mental health and performance of the industry as a whole. Now I've got about half an hour of information for you, and we've got time for questions at the end. And I'll just ask everyone to make sure that you're on mute as we're going, but if you've got a question, feel free to pop your video on. And I'll do my best to answer, though I will provide my contact details. So if we've got more complex questions that I might catch up with you offline to explain a little bit further. Okay, so what I'm going to go through today is just a little bit about understanding psychological hazards for security and looking at the role of leaders in managing mental health at work. And I thought I'd finish up with just a quick personal reflection on some of the characteristics of good mental health, because I know that we've got a lot of leaders within the security industry dialing in today for this webinar, and by and large leaders are not great at taking care of their own mental health. So just a quick reflection for you as well. Now, when I have a look at some of the psychological hazards that security guards face on a day-to-day basis, found some really interesting research, and one in particular about the rates of occupational violence for security. And what I found was that when we look at the workers' compensation claims, occupational violence is the cause of the psychological injury for about 24% of claims. And there's similar rates of violence at work for security as there are for police. And when we look at the types of injuries that are sustained at work, the security operators are twice as likely to sustain a head injury at work, and they're much more likely than police to experience a serious non-fatal injury at work. It's a risky job. Security officers are just as likely to be killed at work as police. And when we look at the highest number of workers' compensation claims, police and security are in the top category for the most number of work cover claims. Now, while most of those work cover claims are not psychological claims, one of the concerns we have with injuries is the time off work. And we know that more time off work leads to less chances of people actually being returned to the workplace. And when we're at home, we tend to really dwell on what's going on and did I do the right thing? And even when someone's got a soft tissue injury, we know that they start to develop the signs of depression within about 2 weeks of being off work. So even though these may not look like psychological injury issues, when we've got physical injuries at work, we need to consider mental health of those injured workers and get them back to work as quickly as possible. Because if recovery occurs at work, we see much better outcomes. Now, when we look at the international data around occupational violence at work, that we see, I'm sure you're not surprised, you know, that 95% of guards say they've been assaulted within their career, that 44% of guards working on the door have needed a hospital treatment, 52% of retail security officers are assaulted 1 to 2 times per month. 25% are verbally abused on a daily basis, and 10% are threatened with violence on a daily basis. And when this piece of research looked at, well, what is the impact of all of that violence at work? What they found was close to 40% of guards would meet criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think this is one of the biggest threats that the security industry faces, given the prevalence of violence and abuse at work. Now, I wanted to just go through what is PTSD. Because it's something that we hear a lot about, but perhaps don't have a great understanding of what's going on. And the process starts with experiencing a critical incident, and our definition for trauma is becoming more and more broad as years go on. So it used to be traditionally you were threatened or at risk, or you saw someone else being threatened or at risk. But it also includes experiencing a motor vehicle accident, a near miss, you're doing something gruesome, you see something horrifying. And when we experience those critical incidents, our automatic response is a fight or flight response. It's a physiological response where adrenaline is released and cortisol into the blood system, ramps up the heart rate, ramps up the breathing rate, pushes all of that oxygenated blood into our major muscle groups, and we tense, coiled like a spring, ready to run or fight. And that's just a natural survival process. And after those critical incidents, the brain keeps recycling the memory of that event. And it's like it goes around and round. You close your eyes and you can see it happening again. So it's really common after a critical incident that people have intrusive thoughts, memories, and dreams of the event, and even flashbacks. And what the purpose of that is, that the brain is trying to desensitize the memory. If it brings it up and you're physically safe, then the intensity of the emotion associated with that should reduce. And it's kind of like if someone's afraid of dogs, that we'd show them a picture of a dog until they feel less anxious. And then we'd probably put them in a car and they'd look at a dog, through the car window, and so each time they do it, they feel a little bit less anxious. And that's what your brain is trying to do following a critical incident. Now, unfortunately, we can get stuck into avoidance coping skills. Because that critical incident is distressing, people try and avoid reminders of the event, avoiding thinking about the event, even trying to avoid feelings associated with that event. And so what tends to happen is, instead of just cutting off feeling bad, we cut off feeling. And so people feel quite numb, loss of interest in things they usually enjoy, loss of loving feelings for people around them. And for about 2 weeks after the event, that stuff is pretty normal and natural. It's when that natural desensitization process doesn't reduce the intensity of that emotion, that's when we start to look at post-traumatic stress disorder. But if we can accept that the brain is going to replay that event and it's okay to have these difficult feelings about it, what we tend to experience then is recovery. And for every potentially traumatic event, 90% of people do not develop symptoms of PTSD, and half the people who do will naturally recover without intervention. The problem we face is when people are experiencing one critical event after another and they don't have sufficient recovery time or the tools in order to cope successfully. And one of the things we can think about is how full your cup is, how high are your revs. So if you'd like to think about the demands in your life like revs on a car, each demand puts the revs up. And if we're not able to bring the revs right down, we sit right on the red. It only takes that little frustration to push you over the edge. And you see that massive emotional response to something that's quite trivial in hindsight. Can you think of times where that's happened to you, where you've just lost it over something small? When we're looking at how people cope with critical incidents, if they're sitting right on the red, that creates a risk factor because they don't have that spare capacity to deal with the surge and the demands that are happening. Now, that's a useful model to think about work stress, the demands that we face at work, and then the resources that we can access at work, which help us to cope. When we look at what those demands are, it's not just critical incidents, but it's also things like not having the right work-rest ratio. If you've got someone who's always working nights, and they're not sleeping well, they don't get that time with their family, probably 5 on 2 off is not the right work-rest ratio for them. When there's role overload, there's too much work to do, not enough time to do it in, and that is just the default setting at work. But role underload can be a stressor as well, people being bored at work. It can put the revs up when we've got poor role clarity. We're not really sure what the nature, like the edges of our role are, like where our job starts and someone else's begins. Or we're unsure in how to do our job because we don't have clear expectations of performance and we don't get feedback about our competency at work. A significant one that puts the revs up is if you're bullied at work, if you're harassed at work, or you're seeing that happen to people at work. Now, if someone's making an allegation of bullying and harassment to you at work, I'd like you to think about it as the canary down the well. Something's happened around communication and leadership where that's occurring. And so thinking about those kind of claims from a systems level, not just one person behaving badly, but what kind of systems are contributing to that. Now, some of the things that help us to bring the revs down at work, having supportive leadership, that your boss checks in on you every now and then, that you have discussions about how work's going. You might even get feedback about how you did on that last job. You might set goals about what you're going to do across the year. We know that sense of professional competence at work is really helpful, and particularly under critical incidents. That sense of confidence, I know how to do my job, is a really protective factor against post-traumatic stress disorder. It's when people are thrust into those high stress situations and they're unsure about how to execute their duties, that creates quite a big risk factor. And so appropriate professional development is really important here. Things that help us to bring the revs down at work are having a good social environment. There's good morale at work, having mates outside of work, people who you can chat to if you need to, people who you can just hang out with and have fun with. We know that having good psychological skills around how to manage stress is important, and it's something that I'll talk about today that workplaces can support their people with. And we know that physical wellbeing helps to bring those revs down. How often you exercise, what's the quality of your diet like, what's the quality of your sleep like, and how much alcohol do you drink? And we know that those 4 lifestyle factors are quite predictive of how high someone's revs are going to be. Now, from a workplace perspective, when we're looking at how does an organisation manage mental health at work, we look at 3 levels of intervention. It starts with managing psychological hazards. What does the organisation do to assess the hazards in the workplace, to mitigate them where possible, to reduce them where possible, and to provide protection for the people where possible. And it's exactly the same framework that we use to think about physical hazards at work. All because those hazards are part and parcel of the workplace doesn't mean that you can leave them without any control measures. Our next level of intervention is to improve responses to those stresses. How do we improve resilience and well-being so that people cope better under those hazards? Our third level of intervention is making sure that we've got treatment options for people have symptoms. And so employee assistance program, EAP fits into this, work cover fits into this category. But if all you're doing for mental health at work is providing counselling, we're missing a big part of the puzzle, and there's a lot of organisational responsibility around managing the psychological hazards at work. So when we're thinking about addressing those psychological hazards, we're thinking about what are the systems that are contributing to occupational risk. So we've got a particular hotspot around aggressive behaviour from customers. What are the contributing factors to that? Maybe we've got a choke point in the flow of customers coming out of a workplace. and because that they're in the mix, that's increasing agitation levels. And actually, we have to consider an environmental or a physical change in order to address it. Do we have appropriate training to reduce those risks? Do guards know how to build rapport with people? Do they have de-escalation skills? Do they have advanced communication skills in order to prevent angry people from escalating into aggressive and violent people? And do you have a critical incident management policy? Do you have escalation pathways which address systems levels impacts on critical incidents and mental health? When we're thinking about workplace responsibilities of increasing resilience to hazards, we look at what competencies do guards have, and are those competencies matched to the workload that they're doing? And one of the reasons why ex-defence and emergency services do so well in security is they have a lot of the stress inoculation training already. That they've, in a systemised way, gone through scenario-based training. And so when you put them in a high-risk environment, that they're familiar with the stress that comes up, and that they've got systems and processes, coping skills that help them to manage that stress and focus on the task at hand. We're also thinking about refresher training. You've got a guard who did his 2-week 1AC course, 5 years ago. What kind of systems do you have around reminders of different interpersonal skills, around different processes that might be helpful, around appropriate note taking? We can't expect that people remember all of what they learned, especially when we know that that basic course has such long days over a really short period of time. What is your workplace doing to teach psychological skills to guards to cope with stress, in particular critical stress? Do they have physical and cognitive strategies which help them to manage that stress load so that when risk goes up, they're still able to perform as required? And what are you doing to support guard wellbeing? Educating them about things like how to cope with shift work. How do you maintain your sleep hygiene when you're working at night? Information or resources around improving physical activity, improving quality of diet. And when we're looking at that third factor, what is your organisation doing to provide treatment options for people who develop symptoms? I know some of the bigger security companies have got EAP providers. Work cover also fits into this category as well. But one of the processes I've seen used quite well is if someone sees their GP, you can get up to 20 rebated sessions per calendar year at the moment. And that people can bring their receipts from that to work and have work pay the gap fee. It's perhaps a more cost-effective way of covering treatment. And you might find that after someone experiences a critical incident, that 2 or 3 sessions with a psychologist shortly after is all that they need. But if you leave that until they go off work, they're avoiding, they're ruminating at home, and you've got a workers' compensation case, and which costs a business on average about $230,000. That's something that you could have nipped in the bud straight away. So thinking about it as a cost-benefit analysis. Now, when I think about the most important process within workplaces for managing mental health, it really comes down to leadership, because leaders are how organisations execute their responsibilities to workers. And when I think about their role within those 3 levels of intervention, we rely on leaders to consult with workers around what those psychological hazards are. And we want to make sure that there's a 2-way system for communication where guards are able to feed up, this is a problem, these are my suggestions, as well as communicating, yeah, we've heard you, we're going to do this, we've considered that. We rely on leaders to identify patterns in incident reporting, because too often we get focused on individuals. And if you ask a who question, who is responsible, you get a who answer. But if you ask a what question, what is responsible for these situations happening, you get quite a different response, and you tend to get information about what systems are contributing to common incidents that pop up. We also rely on leaders to identify and plan appropriate professional development for guards, and that comes down to knowing your people. What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? Where are they going to be best placed within your organisation, given their competencies, given their skill sets, given their confidence? We really rely on leaders within a business to help increase resilience to those psychological hazards. And a big part of that is coaching and feedback. Coaching and feedback to guards on their competencies and performance. How did you do on that? What did you think? What would help you to perform better next time? Giving clear and consistent feedback, clear and consistent expectations. And it's something just to reflect on about what are your performance feedback processes within your business. Because if we've got people who just aren't sure whether or not they're doing a good job, that uncertainty is a bit of a risk factor. But it also means that they're not as likely to use discretional effort. That's that above and beyond, the little bit extra that we're not asked to do. But when people are really clear about what's expected of them, we tend to see an increase in that discretional effort. I think leaders are critical around monitoring and coaching wellbeing, checking in with their people, being available, talking about performance, but talking about how you're going, how you're coping with that near miss that you had the other day, what's working well, and making sure that especially you're checking in around those critical incidents, but also touching base. Because there's a bit of an old adage, that people don't quit workplaces, they quit bosses. And if you've got a boss who provides that operational as well as social support, we tend to get much lower turnover within those organisations. And when we're thinking about mental health for the security industry, emotional intelligence is not just a nice to have, but it's an essential. And what I see regularly is that people are promoted into leadership roles because of duration, time in role, not necessarily because of skill sets on how to manage people and their skill sets. So they're things that we can teach leaders around how to provide that support, having boundaries around that, how to do good coaching on performance and wellbeing. And if you invest in your leaders, that you'll see your business health improve dramatically. The final aspect of the mental health at work is about facilitating treatment. And again, leaders are your centre of gravity here, because they're the ones that are going to notice those symptoms early on. And often it's going to be absenteeism, it's going to be making mistakes and errors, it's going to be conflict at work. And being able to identify that there are some friction points there, and being able to have a conversation to address those concerns, but also to provide encouragement to connect with resources. Leaders are managing that return to work, and it is so important, particularly after a soft tissue injury, that we've got people recovering at work and thinking about some of those creative solutions. You may not be able to have someone standing on the door, but what meaningful work can you give them? Knowing that leaving someone at home injured has a high risk of them developing a secondary injury, that mental illness. One of the key behaviours for leaders in facilitating engagement with treatment is about coaching. And it's something that some leaders are a bit worried about. I don't want to talk to them about their mental health or wellbeing. But when we know that wellbeing is one of our biggest predictors of performance, it's such an important thing for leaders to be speaking about with their people. And I think coaching is where it's at. Coaching questions like, what options can you see here? What would be helpful for you to manage the load? What can we change to make life easier? What would be helpful at the moment? Or what would be a helpful thing for you to do at the moment? So it's not necessarily solving the problem for that person, but it's facilitating a bit of problem solving, giving them a bit of space to be thinking about what's going to be helpful. Now, when we're thinking of encouraging someone into mental health treatment, telling them what to do doesn't help. And something tends to happen when we make an unsolicited recommendation. It tends to activate like the 15-year-old version of us. It's like, you can't tell me what to do. And so if you're going to give a piece of advice to one of your staff, I want you to ask it as a question. Because what you do is you still talk about what that issue is, but it lowers that resistance a little bit. So you think someone needs to talk to their GP about how they feel? Does your GP know about how you're feeling? Have you spoken to your partner about this? Have you tried counselling in the past? How did that go? And what happened when you did this obvious solution that you think of? Like, you've got someone who's not coming into work on time because they're sleeping through their alarm. And you're like, what happened when you got a different alarm? Probably don't use that judgy tone that I just used. But when we ask good questions, we still get to the end state that we're looking for, where someone considers that idea and considers how they might implement in their life without activating that resistance. Okay, so quick and dirty, mental health in the workplace. And just a little bit of a reflection for you, leaders within your businesses, around what are the components of good mental health. And it's a lot of this is kind of not rocket science, and we start with what is your physical well-being like. And I'd like you to just give yourself a score out of 10 for each of these areas, where 10 out of 10 is excellent, could not be doing better. 0 out of 10 is awful, could not be doing worse. So thinking about how much exercise do you do? What's the quality of your diet like? How much fresh food do you eat? Do you eat regularly throughout the day? Do you eat enough vegetables? Do you not eat too much takeaway? How well do you look after your sleep? Do you have a wind down routine at night? Do you allow enough time for sleep? If you're doing shift work, do you have block out curtains? Are you sleeping in a cool, dark environment? Are you making sure that you're not sitting on devices right before you close your eyes? And double screening is a massive issue here, where people are in front of the TV, on their phone or their laptop. And the final aspect of our physical health is about alcohol use. And obviously, more alcohol is not a better score on this one, but it doesn't have to be 0. But we do want to keep an eye on people who are drinking in order to cope with stress, because that tends to. We also have a problem with people who are drinking right before bed, because actually when you have alcohol before you sleep, it gets your body temperature up, and your body never gets the deep rest. So your body actually mimics sleep when you drink alcohol before bed. So giving yourself a score out of 10 for your physical health behaviours. The next area of good mental health is knowing how to tolerate feeling bad. And this is a combination of 2 different things. So we've got cognitive or mental strategies around coping with feeling bad, which start with like accepting that whether or not you want to, you do feel bad. It's okay to have difficult feelings. But it's also challenging negative thinking, being aware of where your attention is. We've been in this workshop for half an hour and your attention has been a little bit on what I've been saying and a little bit on your headspace. Mindfulness is the ability to get out of your head and into the here and now of what's happening and manage where your attention is. It's a really strong stress tolerance skill. The other side of the house is the physiological skills that we use to calm the system down. So when we go through stress, and critical stress in particular, it's like the accelerator. I described that kind of cortisol and adrenaline process with the fight or flight. So it's the accelerator, but we've also got a system which is the brakes. But the accelerator's got to be off for the brakes to come on really well. So part of our ways that we manage stress is by doing things outside of work that bring the revs down. It's also things that we do to manage our physiological response during those critical events themselves. What kind of tactical breathing do you use? What are you doing to manage the racing breathing and racing heart rate? So give yourself a score out of 10 for your confidence in your stress tolerance skills. The next area is about social support. The connections we have in our life are the biggest protective factor to any mental health concern. And so having people in our lives who we can talk to if we need to doesn't mean that you have to, though it is helpful. And the reason for that is when we talk to someone about what's happening, we have to conceptualize what the issue is, what led up to it, how it's impacting on us, and what we can do about it. So we get all of this high quality problem solving. But it's also important to spend time with people who we like, not talking about our problems, and having a mix of those two activities. We also want to encourage people to access support when they need it, to speak to their boss when they're having difficulties at work, speak to their GP, see a mental health professional as required. And the final aspect of good mental health is around having a sense of meaning and purpose. And part of that is being gainfully employed, and feeling that you are useful in your job in some way. But it's also about the balance that you have outside of work, the meaning and purpose that you take from your role with your family, or it could be your role with your community activities, that you volunteer at the tuck shop, you're the secretary of the footy club. And it's also kind of our hobbies and interests, the things that we do in our downtime that help us to have a sense of meaning and purpose. And it doesn't have to be huge, it might be pets, it might be sport, it might be arts and crafts, so it's having something little that helps you to relax and unwind, you have a sense of purpose in what you're doing. So giving yourself a score out of 10 there. And when you look at kind of your scores in each of those areas, I want you to think about if you were to improve one area by 10%, move 1 point up, what would that look like? Because we know when we're trying to change some of these aspects of mental health, if we try and do too much, we don't have the resources because future you has got the same motivation, the same amount of time as current you. So if it's sleep that you want to work on, what would it take to move you from a 3 to a 4? And that might look like, having a device-free evening once a week, or closing the laptop, at 6 o'clock at night instead of 7. So having a think, what would work for you? Okay, so last slide is just a bit of a summary. So when we're thinking about the workplace, we've got to consider what some of the psychological hazards are that are putting the revs up. And we've got to be thinking about what are some of the organisational resources that we're providing to guards to be able to bring the revs back down. Second level of intervention is what kind of training or coaching and mentoring are we providing to staff in order to improve their responses to stresses? And that could be capability-based training, that we're providing training around de-escalation, around building rapport, around kind of advanced communication, or it might be around improving well-being, providing information about how to manage shift work, about identifying mental health issues, how to improve mental health. And the final level is around how do we support staff once they have difficulties, and making sure that you've got systems of referral so that people are connected, but also that you've got leader competency in identifying those issues and having direct conversations about connecting them with support. So I've squeezed kind of an entire master's degree worth of information into a 35-minute presentation. So sorry that I haven't been able to go into the depth that I usually like with this kind of topic. But we've got time now for questions. So if you'd either like to type your question into the chat box, or you can turn your camera on and ask a question, or just use the audio to ask a question. Okay, so question, what do I do if my employees witness or are involved in violence at work? So from an immediate response that I think we need to firstly have a bit of an operational debrief with that person that comes from a supportive perspective, about what happened, with the intent that that guard did the right thing. Because I've seen issues in the past where that operational debrief was done from an ass covering perspective and the assumption the person was in the wrong. And how our leader engages with the employee on that topic is going to make a difference. So well done, you followed processes. We just need to gather information so we can, cross those T's and dot those I's. But also keeping an eye on them around, touching base the next day. How are you sitting with that? How's your sleep been? Do you need any support? And so I think we need to just keep a bit of a closer eye on. It doesn't have to be too intrusive. You might just shoot a little text message to your guard saying how things today, and escalating, if you don't get a response or you get a negative response. And it takes a week or two before someone really falls over if they're going to have issues. And we expect big reactions in the initial couple of days anyway. But offering someone to connect with psychological support might be helpful. And if someone's still quite reactive after 10 days, 2 weeks, then we want to be more directive about engaging with mental health support. Okay, next question. Oh, Brenda, you've got all the good questions. How can I tell if my employees are showing signs of depression because of the long hours? So I think one of the most common signs of depression that you're going to see is absenteeism, people not showing up for work. You're also likely to see mistakes and friction at work, perhaps not following processes, a little bit more conflict. And so one of the ways that depression can impact on people at work is with the team behaviours. How are they interacting with each other? You might see that reactivity, like they're right on the red and only that little frustration pushes them over the edge, that it's such a small change that they have to adapt to and they just have a big emotional response to it. When people are depressed, it's not necessarily seeing that they're sad, though that's going to be one of our indicators as well. But I think monitoring their performance, monitoring their emotional reactivity at work gives you some pretty interesting information, and just absenteeism is always a red flag. Okay, next question. If my work colleague is abnormally negative, is it a sign that something is wrong? I would say abnormally negative, then yes. Like if we see changes to how people usually function, that's something that we want to ask more questions about. Even if someone is just negative, and that's their default setting, I'd be a bit interested in learning a bit more about that, and understanding where that comes from and how it impacts on their performance at work. I'm a big fan of gut feeling, that if you're not sure if something's wrong, but something doesn't quite seem right, then follow that gut feeling. Because our brain is like a mad pattern recognition system. And when something happens that doesn't fit the expected pattern, the way that we perceive that is through a gut feeling something's not quite right. And it's a really powerful message under high stress situations. But when we're working with other people, it's a lead that you've got to follow. And it might be something that's intangible, like you ask someone how they're going and they say, yeah, really great. But the tone, like the pitch is just like a little bit higher than what you expect for that person. So gut feeling, I think, is a good indicator that something's not quite right and you should check in. Do we have any other questions? either popping them in the chat box there, or feel free to pop your camera on and ask. Should I regularly talk to my staff about their mental health? So I think that there's scope for mental health promotion within the organisation, where we talk about mental health awareness, we talk about appropriate help seeking as well. And where I see leaders do this really well is when it's not just raising awareness of mental illness, but they go, yeah, I struggled in the past. This is what I experienced. I didn't get fired. I got treatment and I got better. And so really conveying that message around, like, it's normal to engage in support, and bad things don't necessarily happen. And I think that gives a really good foundation to then have one-on-one discussions. You know, how is your mental health? How are you coping with that thing? How regular it needs to be, I'm not sure, because we can pay too much attention to it. And if you're always asking your staff, are you okay? Are you okay? Are you okay? It sends a message that you don't expect people to be okay. And our expectancy of their coping is actually a really powerful thing. You know, if we think people will get better, then they tend to. But if we expect people to be unwell, they tend to do that too. So I think there's got to be a good balance of being able to have that dialogue, but also expecting that people will cope okay. Okay, if I have experienced the passing away of a loved one, should I get help for the sadness if it affects my work? I think yes. So we expect people to be sad after they lose a loved one, and the severity of that sadness is a direct relationship to the intensity of your love for that person. Um, I I think we do need to access support sometimes in how to cope with that. You know, and I think there's probably a little bit of it affecting your work that's okay. And this is where having a dialogue with your supervisor is so important, to be able to say, you know, that I've just lost someone I love. You know, I need to come into work because that's helpful, but can we manage it, you know, so that it's not high risk, or if I make some small mistakes, it's not going to be a massive issue. So is there a safe way we can have that person at work, and give them a bit of time? But if someone's unable to come into work, they're making massive mistakes that mean that they're unsafe or their colleagues are unsafe, you know, that's potentially something that we might need to address and connect people with work. Next question is there a risk of becoming desensitized to violent situations for security guards? And is this just as serious as being overtly affected by such repetitive incidents? So there is a stress inoculation process to occupational violence. And you think about it, like, for each critical incident that happens, it's like it goes into a wheelbarrow, like a cognitive wheelbarrow. And as each event gets added, like, you're wheeling it. So your strength and your ability to cope with it gets bigger. And that's why people can function really well, you know, in high trauma environments. It can lead to a real disconnection and a loss of empathy for the people around you. And I guess that's what I'm a bit worried about, you know, that you become insensitive to people around you. It's almost like most people have a scale of 1 to 100 of bad things that can happen. But if you're regularly exposed to violence, then you actually have another like 25 points on this scale. And it makes it really hard to relate to people who live life, you know, with things only down that lower end of the scale. And so, you know, if you're constantly being threatened, you know, that customer says, oh, if you don't let me in, I'm going to effing kill you. You know, it makes it hard to be sympathetic with your other half when she's upset because someone spoke to her in a tone today. So there is a concern that people lose a bit of empathy with that desensitization. I would argue, though, from a mental health perspective and a WHS perspective, that we still need to provide a safe environment for our guards to work in. And I don't think that we should accept violence as inevitable. I think we constantly need to seek systems and processes that are going to reduce the violence or increase the guards' capacity to deal with it. Okay, how are we doing for time? 12:45. If there aren't any other questions, thank you everyone for taking the time to dial in. You've got my contact details there if you'd like any information about managing mental health at work or on training systems for guards and leaders. I've partnered with Mindset Securities to develop some training packages that look at focusing on guard wellbeing, looking at guard professional development, and then looking at building leadership capability. So please let me know if you've got any questions around those kind of training solutions. Thank you for your time today, and good luck managing mental health in the workplace. Bye-bye.